Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this FSR debate on CO2 transportation infrastructure regulation. I'm Marzia Cesini, co-hosting today's discussion with Nicolò Rossetto. Hello, Nicolò. Many of you may remember us from last year's FSR Insight series, where we explored energy infrastructures and market challenges, starting from an academic perspective and study. So this time, we are focusing on a critical gap in the EU's CCS framework, the regulation of CO2 transportation infrastructure. So the European Commission is investing heavily in CCS with new funding recently allocated to projects. The Net Zero Industry Act has set a storage target by 2030, but despite this momentum, CO2 transportation remains largely unregulated, with only high-level references in the 2009 CCS directive and different national approaches across Europe. So to help us navigate the topic, we have an excellent panel of speakers, starting with Susanna Seles. She's a policy officer at DG ENER, European Commission. She's closely involved in the preparatory work for future legislation on CCS. Then we have Peter Lusek. He's a senior advisor market at ENSO-G, bringing insights from the perspective of the European gas network operators. And finally, we have Adrien Nicole. He's researcher at the FSR and co-author of today's feature paper, Modeling CO2 Pipeline System. So the research examines the economic properties of CO2 pipelines, demonstrating that they are natural monopolies with significant economies of scale. It also models different pricing approaches, comparing the risk of market power abuse versus the inefficiency of strict regulation. Following Adrien's presentation, each panelist will have 5 to 10 minutes to react. They're going to be touching on how this research fits within the current regulatory debate, what it gets right or perhaps misses, and the perspective on what kind of regulation is actually needed. After that, Adrien will get a chance to respond, and then we'll open up the floor to the audience for the Q&A session. So without further delays, Adrien, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marzia, for the introduction and also for the introduction of the subject. So today I'll be presenting some joint work I've done with some co-authors. So just putting a timer. So this is joint work I did with Diego Cebrejos, Olivier Massol, and Emma Jaguchi-Pearson, my PhD. The title of today's presentation is Modeling CO2 Pipeline Systems, an Analytical Lens for CCS Regulation. If you're interested to have a deeper understanding of what's being said here, because this is a very short presentation, the paper has the same name. So off we go to the next slide, please. So because we don't have much time, I'm going straight into the research question of this paper, which is how does the regulation of CO2 pipeline transportation impact social welfare? So in fact, the reason why we wanted to address this question with my co-authors is that from our understanding in the literature and in general, in current regulatory frameworks, the question of the potential natural monopoly of CO2 pipeline systems was a bit overlooked. So we wanted to have and to make this quantitative assessment to help regulators understand what are the inputs at stake and how did they affect the output and how does regulation impact social welfare. Next slide, please. So the first aspect is that in terms of context, like I said, the question of a natural monopoly was barely mentioned in the literature. So there are a few studies that mention this aspect, the paper by Crae, paper by Massol, the paper by Hogenkamp and Kaminga. So often these studies mention this as saying that this could be a challenge for the future when we'll have more CO2 pipelines, but they don't really do a quantitative assessment. And so what we wanted to do is to do this regulatory assessment. And to this end, we need a cost function. We need a production function to assess how the CO2 pipeline system reacts. And in this perspective, we found that existing cost functions, when we started the study, were not suitable for regulatory assessments. So very briefly, we have these two strands of literature. We had the engineering literature, which is very context specific, which often requires a numerical approximation of some parameters to define a cost function. So that is not suitable for our regulatory assessment, in which we want to have more this general understanding. And on the other hand, you have the network optimization models that tend to oversimplify the CCS cost function in order to keep and make some piecewise linear cost functions that are all also not suited because too oversimplified. Next slide, please. So to compare what was in the literature to what was existing, we identify in the paper three types of approaches. So the first one is what we called the explicit approach, such as the case in the UK, which is strongly inspired by the case of natural gas. So when we were doing this paper, Ofgem was being nominated as the regulator of CO2 pipeline systems in the UK. It was planning to do a regulatory asset-based model, so very similar to natural gas pipelines. This is not necessarily an issue, but it's more like we just identified that it was very inspired by natural gas. The second approach is the state-led approach. So this is the case in Norway. So you might be familiar with the Norwegian Northern Lights project or Longship project, in which the state intervenes directly as a stakeholder of the project. And in fact, for the first decade of operations, we know that the two first emitters were not supposed to pay for some transportation tariff, which will be covered by the state, but that questions what will happen after that first decade of operation. The second aspect is what will happen about next projects. How will they be regulated? Will the state intervene in them as well? Lastly, there is the fuzzy approach, as we called it, in the EU and in the US, which is basically a fragmented governance with unclear regulatory mandates. So in the case of the US, you have, depending if your pipeline is just an intrastate pipeline, if it's in Texas or Wyoming, it won't be regulated the same way. Or if it goes through borders or if it goes through federal lands, then they are administered through a different type of regulation. So that makes it very complicated and often unclear and unsolved in most cases. In the case of the EU, we have the CCS directive from 2009, but which doesn't tell that much about the transportation aspect. So to conclude on this overview, in the paper, we identified that CO2 pipeline regulation is either unclear or a reproduction of existing regulation. So there's a need to understand what should we do next. And to this end, we need to have a production function, or at least something to analyze how we can regulate CO2 pipeline systems. Next slide, please. So in our case, we did an analytical production function. This is not the only way to do a regulatory assessment, of course, but at the moment we started the study, we didn't have much information or empiric data, so we just relied on this analytical framework. So very, very quickly, the system under consideration is a trunk pipeline, a pumping station. We consider some engineering-based equations, and then we convert them into some economic equations, and we obtain a production function. So once we have our production function, we want to see how does this behave. So how does the pipeline operator behave under different regulatory scenarios? Next slide, please. So this is what we do. in the second step. So in the second step, we introduce an aggregate demand function, so an aggregate demand for transportation, and we consider some textbook microeconomic cases. The first best solution, so so-called marginal cost pricing solution, where we just maximize welfare. Then we consider the case of the unregulated private monopoly who maximizes profit. And lastly, the so-called second best solution, where you maximize welfare with the constraint of non-negative profit for the pipeline operator. Next slide, please. And so we obtained the following results. So for the cost function, we obtained the production function that's on the right-hand side, where the output Q is a function of the capital installed and the energy of the pumps. And there are some coefficients that are smaller than 1. On the left-hand side, you see that there is the long-run total cost function in dark blue. It's a concave function, which displays that it has economies of scale, and thus it displays the natural monopoly characteristics. So from this first result, we identified that the CO2 pipeline operator has a status of a natural monopoly. So once we've confirmed that, we want to look into different regulatory scenarios. Next slide, please. And so comparing different scenarios, we obtain very classical textbook microeconomic results. So the first one on the right-hand side, you see that the welfare for the unregulated monopoly greatly diminishes from the first case scenario. We lose approximately 25%. The first best solution, sorry. The second result is that the second best solution, so the average cost pricing solution, reduces less the welfare compared to the first best solution. So these are very classical microeconomic results. But something we found interesting is that we wanted to focus also on quantities, and quantities is not something that you would spontaneously look at. But in our case, what we find is that the second best solution, the average cost pricing solution, diminishes the quantities being transported by approximately 30% compared to the first best. So if I frame it in a different way, we have that classical result that the average cost pricing solution performs well in terms of welfare, so in terms of economic objective, but in terms of quantities transported, hence in terms of quantities being captured, transported, and stored, so in terms of the environmental objective, we're not doing that well with the second best solution. So there is this what we in the paper call the conflicting objective between the environmental objective, the quantities being transported and stored, and the economic objective, the welfare. Next slide, please. So to conclude, the two main findings is that we prove through our analysis that the CO2 pipeline system verifies the conditions for a natural monopoly. This was something that we could have expected. And we find this conflict between environmental and economic objectives. In terms of policy, first of all, the study highlights the need for dedicated regulation, but also it questions the use of non-discriminatory pricing. Indeed, the results we found was in the case that all the participants, so all the capture sites, must pay the same price for transport, but you could imagine a case where you would do some first-degree price discrimination. Theoretically, you could increase the welfare. Thank you for your attention. Next slide, please. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Adrienne. Very thorough and insightful. So just a friendly reminder to everyone participating in the audience, feel free to submit your questions in the Q&A box. Nicolas will be monitoring those. I see already someone has typed in, but now let's move to our discussant. So Susanna, any first reaction, please?
Sorry. Thank you very much. I'm sorry if my voice will change a little bit, but I'm recovering. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be part of this discussion today. And thanks, Adrienne, for the presentation of this very interesting and timely study. From our perspective, you invited me to give somewhat the Commission's perspective on CCUS, on the study, and talk also a bit about our upcoming legislative proposal for CO2 market, CO2 transport infrastructure. So let me start with reiterating that as it's visible also from our latest communications in the last couple of years, CCUS, in our perspective, will play an important role in decarbonizing some hard-to-abate sectors. It also goes in hand with our competitiveness approach, keeping these industries in the EU while helping them to decarbonize. Also, in the 2040 climate target impact assessment, we assessed the need for CO2 capture capacity over the coming decades. And we found that the EU would need 50 million ton of storage capacity in 2030, 280 million ton in 2040, and it goes up to 450 million ton in 2040. So 450 million ton per year injection capacity. These are very, very big numbers, especially if we compare it to the current situation where we had a very limited number of CO2 capture projects, very few transport and storage projects, and there is no CO2 storage site operational in the EU, and especially not on a commercial basis. On the other hand, we have some policies in place, some legislation in place. You mentioned both the CCS directive from 2009, the first piece, which sets the regulatory framework for the safe storage of CO2 in geological formations. Another important element is certainly the ETS directive, the ETS carbon price setting, the incentive for capturing CO2 generated from fossil fuel and industrial processes. We also use the income from ETS in form of the Innovation Fund to finance capture projects. One element of the legislation coming closer to our discussion topic today, to the transport infrastructure, is the TEN-E regulation, the Trans-European Networks in Energy regulation, which acknowledges the need for transport infrastructure and makes them eligible for the status of projects of common interest. So on the current list of projects of common interest, we have 14 CO2 projects and 5 will be supported with Connecting Europe facility. And you also referred to the Net Zero Industry Act, which was absolutely the milestone for us, a regulatory framework which member states can use to support the capture, transport, and storage projects, and the 50 million ton per year injection capacity target, which should be put in place by 2030, financed by obligated entities, gas and oil companies in the EU, and in the coming couple of months, I hope I don't promise too much, but there should be legislation, delegated acts coming out, which identify which are the obligated companies and what will be their pro rata contribution to the 50 million ton, to invest into this 50 million ton injection capacity. So having said that, there are some elements in place, but this is not sufficient, it's clear. The industry is in a very early state of development. We are facing many, many challenges. Deploying certain technologies is still very expensive. There is a difficulty, there is an issue with the visibility of demand and supply. So emitters will only invest in capture technologies if they can be sure there will be transport and storage capacity for the CO2. On the other hand, we will only see investments into the transport infrastructure if there is visibility that there will be captured CO2 over time. And there, of course, what Adrian also mentioned, there is market and regulatory fragmentation. We hear that quite often, the absence of CO2 transport regulatory framework in the EU. And we acknowledged these shortcomings, these challenges. We published the Industrial Carbon Management Strategy in February last year, where we said, these are the issues indeed, and then we will have to develop a regulatory package, a legislative package, which fosters the stepwise emergence of a well-functioning CO2 market and CO2 transport market in the EU, so an internal market for CO2. I also would like to bring your attention to a study of my colleagues in the Joint Research Center, also from February 2024, where they also identified the need for CO2 transport infrastructure. And I believe they also mentioned that, yes, there is a potential character of monopoly, natural monopoly. And in this sense, I fully agree with Adrian and the finding of your study and then your co-authors' study, because we also came to the qualitative assessment so far, not quantitative, but we will get there. So our qualitative assessment is indeed that there might be a natural monopoly, there might be risk of market power abuse, and therefore we also see the need for regulatory intervention. So that's where we are today. We started working on a legislative proposal, very early stages. We are scoping what could be necessary to regulate in the EU CO2 transport infrastructure, and we think around three main topics. So first of all, to create a competitive, cost-effective CO2 value chain. So we will look into the questions how to open the access to all market participants to the infrastructure, how to finance this infrastructure, and of course, in other energy carrier areas, electricity, gas, hydrogen, we normally have third-party access rule, non-discriminatory third-party access rules, and we finance the infrastructure with non-discriminatory and cost-reflective network tariffs. So here, Adrian raised the question whether we should think about something else, something different. Let's discuss this after we also listen to Peter, of course. We will also look at how to avoid conflict of interest among operating different infrastructures or being part of a vertically integrated value chain. Permitting will be certainly a topic we will look at. We also alluded to that in the Clean Industrial Deal, that we will do something on permitting. Another area of topics we will work on is more related to the fact that almost all member states identify CO2 capture as part of their decarbonization strategy, but only a few have the possibility to store CO2 onshore or offshore. So this makes clear that we will transport CO2 and will transport it across member states' borders as well. So we have to ensure that there are rules in place which enable that the infrastructure is interoperable across borders. And in the CO2 world, we also have the need for interoperability among the transport modes, because we have non-pipeline related transport, shipping, trucks, and pipeline transport. So we will look at this. In this context, just to give you an example, the quality of CO2, the specifications, the standards might be an important topic. And the last area is linked to how to provide investor confidence, regulatory certainty, how to overcome coordination problems in the value chain. Here, the challenge is that we would like to give a regulatory framework to a sector which is just developing, so early phase. We should not over-regulate. At the same time, to give investment certainty and regulatory certainty, we will need to show in which direction the regulation goes later on, in which direction the regulations in the member states should converge towards. This is something we believe, for the hydrogen sector. So we are thinking about this. With this, we would avoid ex post harmonization across borders, which can come with additional costs with stranded assets. So this is what we are currently thinking about, outlined with a couple of examples. And we will develop our impact assessment in the coming months. We will organize a public consultation, so strictly along the line of the better regulation framework. We will also organize our ICM, Industrial Carbon Management Forum, at the end of this year. Also a very good opportunity to exchange with the sector, with stakeholders. And we would like to have a legislative proposal adopted around mid next year, mid 2026. And certainly we use the findings of this study. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Susanna. Lots of food you have shared with us. Very, very interesting. So let's see what are Peter's input now, and then we can start discussing further.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be part of this panel discussion on the carbon management. I would like to thank you, Marzia, for the moderating, my fellow panelist Susanna, and also Adrian for the presentation. Well, definitely this is a interesting discussion or presentation so far, and I believe this is the right time, as we heard already, because we are actively engaging in the conversations about the carbon management. And we have heard, and again today confirmed, which I'm very glad for, from the Commission, that there is a regulation on transport of CO2 expected in 2026. So this makes this forum even more valuable, not just for exchanging the ideas, because we will be doing this for some time, but for the contribution to the development of the regulation that should be both fit for purpose and future-proof And I'm very glad that Susanna confirmed that this will be one of the takeoffs to when the regulation is planned. I work for ENSOG, that's the European Network of Transmission System Operators for Gas. And we are trying to make the European grids ready for the energy transition. So we transport gas. Today, it is a natural gas. Many of our members are natural monopolies, and we are regulated. Well, this framework has evolved over the past decades, and in that sense, we can say it's historically proven concept, which has been developed and adapted over time. One aspect I really appreciated in the paper was its demonstration of the hypothesis that the CO2 pipeline system exhibits economies of scale. This aligns with our thinking as well. Pipelines offer the advantage in that, and I'm glad that the Commission also sees that way. Well, the pipelines, they are expensive to build, but they are relatively affordable to operate per unit of gas transported. Well, additionally, I agree with the paper's point on potential informational asymmetry between the CO2 transmission operators and the regulators. This is something we need to keep in mind as we move forward with designing future regulation. I believe our mutual goal is to ensure most effective transmission per unit. I understand that in this stage, the paper uses average cost pricing, and I fully support research into alternative pricing models as well, because even today, we already are seeing different approaches being explored. For example, in the early stages, where the market power of the transmission operator and the shipper are relatively balanced, a negotiated pricing model could offer the most effective solution. However, as smaller participants with weaker negotiating power enter the market, a gradual shift towards a regulated approach may become necessary. Another key point raised in the paper is the concept of optimal sized network. And I believe in this case, planning plays a crucial role here. We already apply this principle when planning natural and hydrogen networks. And it is something that could be very useful as we consider the development of the CO2 transmission network as well. Regarding whether the regulation should be ex ante or ex post in the paper, I believe the regulatory certainty is needed from ideally today. And we heard that the Commission is working on that, which is very good. But I believe it should be gradual, flexible, and adaptable to different applications. Well, over-regulation at this stage could hamper the market development. That's something we have seen in case of hydrogen, particularly the delegated act on low carbon. But we heard that the Commission is already working on that. So hopefully the changes will be made there. The development of the CO2 grids across the EU will certainly differ significantly in scale, purpose, and timing. And therefore, I believe various regulatory approaches can coexist in the EU. And this would reflect the regional and local needs. Well, and indeed, non-discriminatory access to CO2 infrastructure, especially for the cross-border infrastructure, would be a guiding principle of the EU CO2 regulatory framework. To conclude, I see the paper as a valuable piece in the puzzle as well, in shaping the future regulatory framework. We need regulation to be introduced quickly to provide the market certainty, but it also must remain flexible to accommodate the different needs. And I believe achieving this balance will be key to helping the effective development of the industrial carbon management. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Peter, for your insights into the world of the transportation and infrastructure. So let's revert back to Adrien for his comments. And I will encourage also Peter and Susanna, if they want to jump in the conversation, feel free to do so.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Marta, and thank you, Peter and Susanna, for the great comments and the very long comments. Much appreciated. And I agree, this paper is like it's like a first stone. It's like we're trying to build a conversation, but obviously it doesn't solve. It raises more questions than it solves. I like to say it this way. But anyways, I think the main maybe I'm taking the comments in order, but I think the first discussion is really on this non-discrimination that we discuss in the paper. To be fair, I think it's so what we did in the paper is a very analytical model. It's very theoretical, hence also the average cost pricing. We know it's something that is very theoretical and common in microeconomics, but in reality, life is a bit different, but I'll get over that. But on the non-discriminatory aspect, it's more of a way of saying that the average cost pricing solution maybe does not perform that well. And maybe in terms of welfare, if you make each emitter pay his willingness to pay, you could increase welfare as such. But then to take a more realistic case, I think for me, the main why would you justify having discriminatory pricing? I think it would be to have the important factor to have is cost reflectivity. And so if I take an example of, for example, an industrial emitter in France transporting his emissions, let's say through Belgium to send them to Denmark, and you have an emitter also in Denmark that captures its emissions. Well, maybe the emitter in Denmark won't be willing to have a non-discriminatory pricing that will favor maybe the French emitter that is very far from the storage place and would rather just have a different price for him and for the French industrial site. So I think the main issue that I'm trying to develop here is that maybe prices should be more cost reflective and we could accept some part of discrimination. Then again, we said that pipeline exhibit economies of scale, and I think that pipeline transportation is mostly about the volumes being transported more than the distance. So I think maybe in that case, it wouldn't necessarily justify having a discriminatory price for pipeline transportation, but maybe it would be relevant for shipping transportation, but that's maybe not the subject here. So one of the problems or the challenges that we have is the question of investors. So you've mentioned it, Susanna, about we have an emerging infrastructure and there's the risk of over and under regulation, and there's this question of access that also Peter mentioned. And I feel I really agree on the fact that it has to be gradual, and we have to understand that there are different needs. And if I sum up the comment of Peter in maybe one word, but maybe you'll disagree, but I think we have heterogeneous emitters. And the fact that when we're talking about CCS, we're talking about cement producers, steel producers, we're talking about power generation, and they each have different sizes, some of locations that are distributed across the country. Some are more located in industrial clusters next to storage sites, etc., etc. So from my understanding, this heterogeneity is something that makes regulation very complicated and very complex. And I think we need to maybe understand that each industry has its own needs. And there's also, if I go deeper into the subject and further reinforce the challenges at stake, is that for some industries, you have alternatives to decarbonization, but for some of them, not that much. And if I go back now to a remark by Susanna, there was the question of the incentive of the EU ETS, and this will affect differently depending on the industry. So some have like I think cement producers have an average cost of capture around 50 euros per ton of CO2 avoided. It really depends on the calculations, but whatever. And on the other hand, you have some pulp and paper industry, for which the cost of capture might be 100 euros per ton. So how do you deal with that? So that's the way of saying that there's a lot of challenge, and I agree we need to consider that there are different needs, and maybe we need to address that through different types of regulation. I think a very interesting point that you've raised, Peter, was the question of the negotiated access, and saying that maybe some small players might suffer from this in the early stage, and maybe for them address this, have more of a regulated access. To be honest, I never thought about this, and I think it's very relevant. And yeah, so that's it at the moment on what I wanted to say, but maybe you already want to react on what I've just said.
Thank you, Adrian. Please, Susanna, Peter, if you want to jump in, the floor is yours.
I'm happy to jump in and pick up a couple of issues. Yes, indeed, cost reflective tariffs is a guiding principle for our legislative framework for electricity, gas, hydrogen. So this will be relevant here as well. Of course, when we want to go further in different treatment, we need to be objective and justified. And here, I think this will be more difficult with a market regulatory framework. So our market regulatory framework in the other sectors, and I think we will try to reproduce these ideas for CO2 transport infrastructure, is to create an enabling regulatory framework. In the EU, we like to use other tools to support certain sectors, to subsidize, and member states will look into the possibilities using state aid for certain industries to decarbonize. But this, in our view, should happen outside of the market. And when the market functions, then we have the rules. One element mentioned by both of you, yes, the negotiated access rules, negotiated third-party access, this is absolutely possible. It doesn't mean that there cannot be transparency linked to the negotiated third-party access in a monopoly situation. The regulatory oversight should be there, and some sort of transparency. So even if you negotiate, you might need to publish the costs or the agreed tariff. So there are some ways to make or even the negotiated access rules a bit more, how to put it, less differentiating, because I agree that a negotiated third-party access can be a very good approach at the beginning of a certain process. And this is something we also did in the hydrogen regulatory framework. And this is what we also have to consider, because we are obliged to, and because it makes sense, what is the added value? What can be left to member states to design? For example, tariffs are traditionally the topic where member states step in, a regulator and the regulated entity together, put together the tariffs, the methodologies, calculate the tariffs. And this is something which is better set at member state level, because also member states will see how the capture population will develop, what sort of capture sites, what sort of industries are there in a member state. This will vary, as you said, Adrian. So we have to leave flexibility. We are very, very keen on that. And then there were a couple of questions in the Q&A. I don't know if you would like to go into it, but probably it's an interesting ball to pick up, the question on repurposing, because I would also be interested in repurposing. We do not have much information either. Well, on the technical feasibility, we have some information. It seems to be more challenging than repurposing for hydrogen transportation. Costs numbers we do not have. So normally we say it's cheaper and quicker to use existing but not needed gas infrastructure to repurpose it to transport hydrogen or transport CO2. But the question remains how expensive it is in reality. So I go so far and then happy to continue.
Thank you. Thank you. So if I may react.
Yes.
Well, to Adrian first. Well, yeah, as you said, that basically the emitters, they are very complex and they have different needs. And I would add to that complexity, and it is also the member states. They have different rules. They have different attitudes, and they have also different availability for the CO2 storage onshore. Then the third-party connection, that's another layer. And last but not least, that's the public perception. In some countries, the public is fully all right having their CO2 stored beneath their homes. In some countries, the population is really strictly against. So that's another complexity layer there. If I may react to the repurposing part, yes, we are looking also on that one, but this is really complex. It's even a step further than when we comparing the natural gas and hydrogen. Basically, what we need to see here that the CO2 transportation is in competition with the natural gas and hydrogen. So this is I would say maybe the hardest part to consider when talking about repurposing. So if we take a pipe out of as an energy carrier, is this then enough to fulfill the security of supply and all the contracts, or not? So that's one layer of complexity. And but yeah, as we heard, there is a possibility to repurpose some of the pipes. We already heard from our members that especially for the lower connection pipes, I mean lower pressure pipes connecting to big industrial emitters, there is a potential for repurposing. But then when we move to transmission, for example, or the transport, long-haul transport, we could call it a trunk pipelines. Our members are more talking about the so-called dense phase of the CO2. So, and this is again, it's a higher pressure, it's a different behavior of the gas itself, and these, what we heard from our members, would require building a whole new infrastructure. So that would be it, if that is enough as a reaction.
Yes, more than enough. Thank you, Peter. Yes, I've taken so many notes during these debates, but let's see if our audience have some additional question aside repurposing, which we have already tackled. Nicolas?
Yes, we got quite a few questions. Well, first, we have a comment by Thomas from Belgium, I suppose, who said that recently that country chosen a regulated approach with regulated access to pipelines and but negotiated access to terminals. So I would say there is a hybrid decisions. Then we have a question by William. Not sure he made it before or after Susanna shared some information, but William would be interested to have a timeline for the proposals by the European Commission on CCS legislation. I don't know, Susanna, if you can share again the tentative timeline on this.
Yes, very quickly. So we will start developing an impact assessment. We will organize a public consultation and the next edition of the ICM forum still this year. And then we would like to bring out a legislative proposal mid-2026 or Q3 2026. I cannot commit as of now because this is still in development phase. I hope that helps. And on permitting, there might be something a bit earlier, as we said in the Clean Industrial Deal, to look at the permitting by the end of this year.
Thank you. Then we have quite a few questions. One of them refers to the possibility, I assume, it's the question by Caterina, to store CO2 outside the EU, which then, of course, poses the question of transporting the CO2 out of the EU. I don't know if any one of the panelists, Adrienne, Peter, or Susanne, have any information to share with Caterina.
Maybe I can step in, and maybe Susanna will correct me, but I think that in the Net Zero Industry Act target of 50 million tons of CO2 by 2030, I think it's only inside the EU and does not include EEA countries. So hence, it does not include Norway and the UK, where a lot of projects are going on at the moment, but I could be wrong. And then concerning is it the question of availability, I think, but I think, Katerina, if you're interested into where the CO2 might be stored, you can look at the projects of common interest. So a few of them include Norway, in the UK, of like storing the CO2 in those zones. I think that's on my perspective for this. I also, sorry, I just the occasion, but just on repurposing, I know that some academics did a study in Scotland about how could we repurpose a natural gas pipeline for a CO2 pipeline. And it was very interesting because they find this trade-off, like for low capacity, it's nice to reuse the pipeline, but above a certain capacity, I think it was 16 million tons of CO2 per year, I'm not sure. It's better to just build a new pipeline. And it's exactly like Peter said, it was the idea of switching from a gas phase to a dense phase. It means using pumps instead of compressors, and there's a trade-off above which you just rather build a new pipeline. But yeah, and also I wanted to I will just keep on talking, but thank you, Thomas, for the remark on the Belgium case of how they did it, the regulated TPA and negotiated TPA. I think France also is considering distinguishing between, if this is the pipeline, the national pipeline infrastructure, then it might impose regulated TPA, third-party access, sorry. On the other hand, if it's a local industrial cluster, then I think the option is still open for a negotiated TPA. So there's also these considerations. That's it for me.
Okay, so maybe we can move to the series of questions by Vijay. Among them, maybe one particularly interesting is for Susanne. It's about the initiatives that the European Commission would put in place to ensure that no member state is left behind. And since he refers to countries that probably have limited areas suitable for CO2 storage. So let's say I can translate the question, and it's, do you think that the European Commission should do something or will do something to, let's say, provide some storing capacity also for this country. Please, Susanna.
Okay, thank you. So yes, of course, as I also referred to, we understand that not every member state have the geological formations onshore, offshore to store the CO2. Nevertheless, they have an interest in capturing and storing the CO2 somewhere. And that's why for us, it's extremely important to have a regulatory framework in place, which will enable the development and the use of CO2 transport infrastructure, which can bring the CO2 from those countries where they cannot store it, be it, for example, landlocked countries, to even offshore areas to store it. So this is what we talk about when we say we will need this infrastructure in place, which will also cross borders. So that's why rules on interoperability on cross-border points is important. That's why we will have to have rules on how to ensure the unhindered flow of that CO2 from, let's say, Austria to Germany to harbors to get on another pipeline or take a ship and be stored in offshore storages, for example. And then let me just come back to the question about outside the EU. It's not in the 50 million tons, Adrienne, absolutely correct. But of course, we know the reality. The UK has storages, the Norway has storages, what to do to make use of these storage formations. And of course, it would also mean, especially when we look at the UK, that it's very close to certain member states. So it could be a cheap transport to the UK storage areas. But currently, under the London Protocol, we cannot export waste. CO2 is waste. So there is an international legislative framework which does not allow us to do so. We will look into it. Of course, it's not in our hand to change such an international agreement, but we will look into this possibility as well.
Thank you, Susanna. Well, it's interesting because then actually we have also the question of Luigi, who mentioned a possibility. We were discussing about non-discrimination, and basically he wondered, should we discriminate based on the use of the captured CO2? Because CO2 to be disposed in some storage facility indeed is a waste, but if we can use it for something else, then it's becoming a secondary raw material. So he wondered whether we should differentiate maybe the tariff depending on the use of the CO2. I don't know if anybody wants to comment or wants to react to the question by Luigi.
Well, if I may, I'm wearing the TSO's hat right now, so I would say we transport the CO2 no matter the origin. This will be, we hopefully will transport the CO2. Well, I believe this decision or this consideration, this would be maybe more on the designers of the market in the future. Because we already heard the discussions that some of the CO2 could be priced differently than the others. So, and these could create the incentives for the market participants then manage the CO2 differently. So I believe this depends on the how the designers of the market see the future and the potential of the carbon either captured from the air or from the industrial establishments or even from bio sources. So yeah, it's a question. And whether the CO2 is afterwards used, yes, again, depends on how the market will be designed. So this is just a general perspective from me. And I would leave the floor to the others.
Any comment by Adrienne or Susanna on this? Otherwise, I
don't know, please. No big. I was gonna say I don't have a big comment on or a big thought on this, but I never thought about this. But my feeling is that if you use CO2 and then, well, the transportation network that you're using, it's not, the sink won't be the same. So you're transporting CO2 from one facility to another facility and not into the ground. So you would have, I guess, distinct networks for CO2 that you're using and CO2 that you're storing. So I think you could implement some different type of regulation, I guess. But then again, I don't know what the network will be in the future. But in my vision, you won't have one. You will probably not have a single transportation infrastructure that mixes both CO2 that's going to be stored and CO2 that's going to be used. But maybe the future will tell me wrong, but I don't know.
Well, it's interesting, and probably, well, we had already some of this discussion for electricity and gas, because especially at the FSR, we tend to say that make the tariff cost reflective, and then if you want to subsidize or to support some specific use of the thing you carry, you act on the price of the product you carry. So you support, I don't know, self-consumption of renewable electricity, but not the transportation of electricity made from renewable energy sources. But I'm not an expert. Just if we have time, the last question by Katia. Katia, let's say, bring us to the recent adoption of the decarbonized gas and hydrogen package. And she wondered if we learn something out of it. And in particular, she noticed that in the package, there is not much regulatory flexibility. And in particular, when we want to take into account the implications for security of supply. And she wondered, yeah, if we can use some of these lessons learned for the future or for coming CCS package, as we put it. I don't know if anybody of you wants to comment and to reply to Katia.
I would be happy to start because it's our package. So even if, of course, it's not our package, but our proposals agreed by the co-legislators. I somewhat disagree with Katia because I think we did cater for this aspect, even if it's true that we have separate legislation on the market regulatory framework and on the security of supply for the gas infrastructure. But what we implemented in the gas and hydrogen package is a way of planning decommissioning infrastructure. So there will be at the national level DSO decommissioning plans for not needed gas distribution pipelines. And the TSOs will also have to include this information in the TSO level national planning. So the operators will have to identify those infrastructure elements where the demand is too low to keep them operating as gas infrastructure. And then, of course, in that process, they will have to take into account many elements, and member states will certainly cater for that, and the regulatory approval on these plans will be necessary. So they will take into account security of supply, the need to move certain lost users of the gas infrastructure to other heating or energy sources. So this is included in the recent package on top of what is in the security of supply legislation with other aspects.
Thank you. Maybe a very quick reaction from Pedro or Adrienne. Otherwise, I give back the screen to Marzia. No? Okay, so Marzia, I think our time is almost over.
Yes, we're right on time, 1 minute left. So we have been, I'm sorry for the question that we were not able to get to, but our time is limited. So lots of has been discussed today from the landscape of heterogeneous emitters that make the regulation very complex. We touched upon the fact that we need to create an enabling regulatory framework. We looked into the access rules and transparency that needs to be there, but also what is left to member states versus EU level. And so the fact that we really need to leave some flexibility also to member states. But then we span to the public perception and to repurposing, which is seems to be very challenging. We don't know how much it costs, but it also taps into security of supply issues. So lots of food for thoughts, and we will be happy to revert again with another debate on this topic with our precious panelists. Susanna Seles, thank you so much. Peter Lusek, again, thank you for joining us. And then to our own Adrien Nicol for sharing his knowledge on the topic. And of course, to my co-host, Nicola Rossetto, for dealing with the Q&A session, never easy. So if you're interested in more FSR discussion on CCS, gas markets, infrastructure regulation, stay tuned for upcoming events and publications. With that, thank you all again, and have a great rest of the day.
Goodbye. Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you.